Hello there, and welcome back to the Judge Program for Star Wars Unlimited Level 1 Certification Track Lessons. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and today we'll be covering the Comprehensive Rules, Section 5, Game Structure. This is another relatively short section, and one that we've covered extensively because of its importance to, well, how the game plays out. Of course, we'll be going into more detail than we have before, with more complex examples than we've previously covered. A game consists of rounds, and a round consists of turns, and a turn consists of actions. And that's all you need to know. We'll see you in the next one. Of course, there's more to it than that. A game does consist of rounds. Each round is the action phase and regroup phase, which have steps within them. The action phase is where players take turns going back and forth, taking actions, and the regroup phase is where the game runs a little bit of maintenance. Players draw cards, put them into play as resources, and ready their cards so that they can go again for another action phase. It's important to make sure that you're using the terms round and turn correctly. Many games may use the term turn to indicate what Star Wars Unlimited calls a round, and so when you're communicating with players or studying the rules, keep in mind the appropriate context. Of course, there's also the bonus that the word round is used in a broader tournament sense to mean the match is being played. It's been so ingrained in me that that is a round that I can't think of a better name for it. If you have any ideas, be sure to mention them in the community Discord. Each step of setup and each step of each phase must be completed in full unless otherwise specified. So let's dive into it. There are 6 steps to setting up the game. 1. Put bases into play. 2. Put leaders into play. 3. Determine the first player. 4. Shuffle decks and draw opening hands. 5. Make mulligan decisions. 6. Resource cards. The first 2 can be accomplished in any order. Players aren't making any decisions here. They already have their base and leader selected and are just revealing them and putting them into the base zone. Step 3 is the first time players actually make a decision, determining the starting player. On a technical level, you actually determine which player chooses who starts with initiative, which means that the player who wins the die roll or coin flip doesn't have to go first, and that this scales up to multiplayer games with no changes. Once the starting player, or the player who begins with initiative, is locked in, players shuffle their decks. In tournament play, they are required to then present their deck to their opponent, who may cut or shuffle the deck to further ensure randomization. After that, players draw their opening hands of 6 cards. If a player doesn't like their hand, they may choose to take 1 mulligan by returning all of the cards in their hand to the deck, shuffling, presenting, and drawing a new 6-card hand, which they must keep. Taking mulligans is the first step that is not simultaneous. If players are waiting to see what their opponent does, the active player, the one who has the initiative, must decide whether or not they're taking a mulligan first. After they make their decision, their opponent can make theirs. However, a player can't force the active player to be unable to take a mulligan by quickly declaring whether or not they are. If a player skips ahead in the sequence of declaring mulligans, and similarly with putting resources into play in the regroup step, the active player does not get locked out of making a decision. They just have more information to work with than the rules require them to have. Finally, both players resource 2 cards from their opening hands. Unlike cards being put into play as resources normally, these resources are ready. Players cannot choose to resource fewer cards. This means that players will begin the first action phase with 2 ready resources and 4 cards in hand. A round, as we mentioned back in the overview, consists of 2 phases in order, the action phase and the regroup phase. The start of the action phase step is also the start of a new game round. Anything that refers to this round, like no good to me dead, encapsulates both the action phase and the regroup phase. If it's somehow played during the regroup phase, it will end at the end of that regroup phase. Unsurprisingly, the first step in the action phase is the start of phase step, along with the requisite triggers and effects. 3 types of abilities and effects can occur now, and they occur in a prescribed order. This order also applies for the end of the action phase, the start of the regroup phase, and the end of the regroup phase. In order, it is lasting effects, then delayed effects, and then triggered abilities. First, any lasting effects wear off. These are effects that say this phase or this round. There are also some with shorter durations, like for this attack, but those aren't relevant to game structure. These end immediately at the noted time, before anything else can happen. Most of the time, these wear off at the end of the phase, like on Attack Pattern Delta or General Raiken. If multiple lasting effects have the same end condition, they end simultaneously, so a unit that has been chosen for both tactical advantage and hello there wouldn't be under the effect of both, and then under the effect of neither. Next are delayed effects. These are effects that were set up by the resolution of an ability previously and are resolving now. These are phrased with at the start of or at the end of, like on Final Showdown or Triple Dark Raid. These can be effects that require a player to do something, which sets them apart from being lasting effects. Finally, there are triggered abilities. These are abilities that trigger when a phase begins or ends. These are phrased with when the action phase starts, or when the regroup phase starts, as seen on the leaders Grand Admiral Thrawn and Dr. Aphra. These also require players to do something, but were not established by a previous ability, which is what distinguishes them from delayed effects. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Well, I want to thank some of our Judge Apprentices for this. While we've talked about the sequencing before in the Judge Apprentice lessons, I hadn't been able to come up with an example where it would have a relevant gameplay impact rather than just a technical one, and some Judge Apprentices came up with an example where this sequencing matters. The active player controls a leader, Dr. Aphra, and earlier in the round played Sneak Attack playing Inferno 4. After the action phase, we move to the start of the regroup phase. Delayed effects trigger now, so Sneak Attacks at the start of the regroup phase defeated, effect applies, and Inferno 4 is defeated. This triggers Inferno 4's when defeated triggered ability, which then resolves, and the active player is able to look at the top 2 cards of their deck and choose to put either on the top or bottom of the deck. After that, Dr. Aphra's start of phase ability triggers, and the top card of the deck is discarded. Between starting and ending the action phase, there are player turns. During each player turn, they alternate taking actions, starting with the player who had the initiative counter when the phase began. We've gone over the actions players can take several times now, but we'll list them out again because a reminder never hurts. Play a card, attack with a unit, use an action ability, pass, and take the initiative. We went into detail regarding passing and taking initiative in L1 Lesson 3, Game Concepts Part 2, in Section 1.15, and we'll go into detail with the other 3 in the next lesson, Action Timing and Clarifications. Now, once both players have passed in succession, the step ends and the end of phase step begins, before moving on to the regroup phase. Following the action phase is the regroup phase. Like the action phase, the regroup phase begins and ends with the start of phase and end of phase steps, but it also has 3 other steps: the draw step, the resource step, and the ready step. The start and end of phase steps function the same way they do in the action phase, with lasting effects, then delayed effects, then triggered abilities. The other 3 steps are pretty straightforward. In the draw step, each player draws 2 cards simultaneously. If a player attempts to draw cards from an empty deck, they take 3 damage for each card they were unable to draw. If the active player has 2 remaining HP on their base, and their opponent has 6, neither player has any cards in their deck, they would both attempt to draw 2 cards, then take 6 damage, and be defeated, all simultaneously. This would result in the game being a draw. In a best of 3 setting, like many tournaments, a drawn game doesn't count towards the result of a best of 3. That's because best of 3 actually means first to 2 wins, and neither player won the game. In the resource step, both players may resource 1 card from their hand, putting it into play face down and exhausted. If players want to see what their opponent is doing, the active player must choose whether or not they are resourcing and putting a card into play as a resource before their opponent does. As mentioned previously in this lesson with mulligans, the non-active player can't force this action by acting preemptively. Finally, in the ready step, players ready all resources and units they control. This conveniently includes the resource that they may have just put into play. As soon as the regroup phase ends, the next action phase begins, with the start of phase. The game continues in this cycle until 1 player is defeated. A game ends immediately once a player's base reaches 0 remaining HP and is defeated. A player whose base is defeated loses the game, and their opponent wins the game. As soon as a player's base reaches 0 HP, they cannot take any actions and cannot resolve any abilities or effects. Let's go over a quick example. The active player has 2 remaining HP on their base, and their opponent has 3 remaining HP on theirs. The active player plays Mercenary Company, ambushing their opponent's OOM series officer. They deal 1 damage to the officer and 3 damage to their opponent's base, defeating both of them. The non-active player does not get the opportunity to deal 2 damage to the active player's base. Finally, a player can concede at any time, and doing so causes them to lose the game immediately. If you're playing in a best of 3 and know you're probably going to lose the game, you can concede when your opponent plays a Viper Probe Droid before they're able to see your hand and preserve some of the information about your deck for a future game. However, a player cannot concede to avoid an infraction or penalty. If a player commits an error while they are allowed to concede the game, the infraction and penalty will still be recorded and issued. With the end of the game comes the end of this lesson. Our next scheduled lesson will cover action timing and clarification. Although it's only a couple of pages, I might say that they're action-packed. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or insights, be sure to join the Judge Community Discord and make your voice heard. Until next time, good luck and have fun.